My name is Brooke Ivy. We've got a couple more actually coming in. I am the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for the Alaska Children's Trust. And so we just want to thank you all for being here today. I know it's very hectic time of year, especially when you're involved in a campaign, and we know that your time is precious. So just really appreciate you taking the time to join us and learn more about issues directly impacting children, youth, and families, and how we can make Alaska better for all Alaskans. And I'm with the Alaska Children's Trust. Vote for Kids is one of our programs, but it's not just us. There's many partner organizations that are part of this effort to really raise the volume and elevate issues surrounding children, youth, and families during this election season. So this is a statewide nonpartisan campaign. And just as a reminder, we do not endorse candidates, and we're completely nonpartisan organizations here on this call today. And so just on that note, actually, I mentioned we'll cover a variety of topics, and we really know that with 1 hour, just over an hour, we're only scratching the surface. So just know that if there's anything that piques interest for you, or you'd like to learn more, we've got a lot of wonderful partners on this call that are great resources. And if there's not something that we don't address today, you can always reach out to us, and we can try and connect you with someone who works on that issue for children and families in Alaska. So just what to expect on today's call, we'll be going through sort of a speed dating round of a lot of issues that are important, most important of what we're hearing on the ground from families that we talk to and services that we know are important or lacking thereof in Alaska for both young children as well as youth, and of course their parents. Today's call, what to expect, we'll be going over prevention of child abuse and neglect, tribal compacting, childcare, early childhood, out of school time, foster care, child hunger and poverty, and youth mental health. So these will just be very quick, brief introductions on the need and potential solutions, and we look forward to chatting with you. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Trevor Storrs. He's the president and CEO of the Alaska Children's Trust, and I'll let him tell you more about what ACT does.
Thank you so much, Brooke, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all the speakers that will be coming here shortly. The Alaska Children's Trust, many of you know, is a statewide lead organization focused on the prevention of child abuse and neglect. As you can imagine, there's no one cause, no one solution for the prevention of child abuse and neglect. It's a very complex issue. If we go to the next slide. We are hosting today just due to the fact that because it's a complex issue, we recognize that there's many variables that play into the cause of child abuse and neglect. And our ultimate goal is, we know when children, youth, and families are thriving, the risk of child abuse and neglect goes down. And the way we look at child abuse and neglect is, like, I use the analogy of an elastic band, and it represents life. And when we're born with a race, a gender, abilities, possibly disabilities, location, socioeconomics, a variety of things. And they at times either provide challenges or barriers and or privileges. But either way, we start with that elastic band, sometimes with tension, sometimes not. And that tension is a variety of things in life, stressors. There can be positive, negative, or toxic. Toxic meaning like child abuse and neglect, experiencing that, exposed to domestic violence, adverse childhood experiences, which hopefully many of you have heard about. And when an individual has the knowledge, skills, supports, and or resources to address either the positive, negative, or toxic stress, that tension can go away. But if it doesn't, it stays there. And like life, there's not just one stressor. It builds. And again, if you don't have the knowledge, skills, supports, or resources to lessen that tension, to address it, it will stay. And like any elastic band, it can only be stretched so far. And when it snaps, that's when child abuse and neglect can occur. And the work that we do at the Children's Trust, and all the work that you're going to be hearing about and the issues, we are trying to make sure that our children, families, and youth have that knowledge, skills, supports, and resources to thrive. Next slide, please. To understand where our children are, or really the question that we always ask is how are our children doing? We look at Kids Count. It's a national program through the NEKC Foundation. We are the state chapter. And here you will see our rankings. You see the rankings here since 2015. Our current ranking is 43. The most recent ranking will be coming out here in a couple weeks. You will learn about that then. And hopefully many of you have heard or received information about Kids Count. But this shows that we have been in the bottom half, if not the bottom quarter, on a consistent basis. And if you look before 2015, you would definitely see that we are most typically in the bottom quarter. Child well-being is looked at or is determined through 4 core areas. If we go to the next slide, it's education, health, economic well-being, family and community. And in each one of those categories, there's 4 specific indicators that we look at. Now, even though we are 43rd currently, this does not mean that Alaska is a bad place, or we've got great things that are going on and the great successes. You'll hear about some of them, but we do need to recognize that we do have struggles in our state. We know that our numbers, that we have one of the highest rates per capita of child abuse and neglect in the nation, suicide, and the list goes on. But we're also doing very well in other areas, which is important. But what these books do is start helping us answer the question is, how are our children doing? And in some ways, they're doing okay. But in many ways, our children, youth, and families are struggling. With that, I'll pass it back to Brooke, and she will introduce you to our first speaker. And just as a reminder, you can learn more about the Kids Count. There's the website there at the bottom of the slide, and it provides not just some data, but there's a whole database that you can explore and learn vast amounts of information about how our children, youth, and families are doing in Alaska. Brooke?
Thank you, Trevor. And yes, so our next speaker is Nicole Borromeo from the Alaska Federation of Natives. And actually, before we move on, I would be remiss, I had meant to include at the beginning a land acknowledgement. So we are calling in here from the Alaska Children's Trust from the land of the Dena'ina people and where we live, work, and play. So we wanted to take a moment to honor that. And then I'll pass it over to Nicole.
Thanks, Brooke. Good afternoon, everyone. I think Brooke is also going to pull up a PowerPoint that I got in extremely under the wire here about 3 minutes ago. It's been one of those days. So I'm just going to then go ahead and introduce everyone to the topic of compacting if you've never heard it before, and what our tribes are doing to help administer child welfare throughout the state. The Alaska Tribal Child Welfare Compact has been really a work in progress for the last 2 decades. It came about because of the significant disparities in child welfare numbers when you look at Alaska Native children who are in state custody compared to their overall population statewide. Oh, there we go. There's the compact. I am going to be talking fast. I know there's so many other presenters who have scheduled time today with you. So if you feel like you missed something, you're going to be provided the slide deck afterwards. You can follow up with me also as well, and Brooke will go ahead and share my contact information. But yes, there's significant disparities in the system. Our kids from the Native community make up 15% of the state's general population, but when you look at how many are in custody, it's 60%. So when you see a disparity like this, it just reeks of a system failure, and there's no exception here when it comes to child welfare. The other reason that this work is important is that the State Office of Children's Services has significant difficulty keeping frontline workers and other workers at OCS. They typically operate around a 50% vacancy rate and carry caseloads 3 times the national average. Next slide. The work did begin, like I said, 2 decades ago with a working group between state and tribal representatives and other invited stakeholders. The goal at the time was to make sure that the state was better complying with the Indian Child Welfare Act. That is a special act that was passed by Congress to also address the removal of American Indian and Alaska Native children from Indian homes. And again, back to the disproportionality again, loss of Alaska Native kids in state custody, and the state and tribe knew that they had to work better and build and strengthen relationships. The other way that the work began is through the existing funding mechanism, which comes from Title 4E of the Social Security Act. 4E agreements provide federal resources, AKA dollars, to the state and to the tribes to help with foster care, transitional independent living programs, guardian assistance, adoption, etc. So most of the 4E money relates to removal, which is why you do see a big spike in states around 4E and the implementation of it, including Alaska. Why it's so important is because tribes receive a higher reimbursement rate than states do under 4E agreements. So this should also be looked at as a way to lessen the amount of state dollars that go out the door if we can have more tribal 4E agreements in place. Next slide. In the simplest form, a compact is just an agreement. But what it is it's an agreement between two sovereigns, the state of Alaska and a number of Alaska Native tribes, either individually or by delegated authority to their tribal consortium at the regional level. And it's also an agreement that has been negotiated. So it's not like a grant. It's not similar to what OCS does with church groups or other nonprofit groups, because tribes are sovereigns. It's a different level of negotiated decision making. The goal of the compact, straight and simple, is to provide higher quality services than OCS otherwise could at a lower cost to the state. Next slide. The Alaska Tribal Child Welfare Compact just did not come completely out of thin air, but as I like to tell state policymakers, federal lawmakers as well, and other stakeholders, it is modeled after the federal government compacts that the federal government, Indian Health Service and Bureau of Indian Affairs traditionally negotiates under the Indian Self-Determination Act. So that is the foundational model that the tribes and state looked to when they negotiated this. It's historic in the sense that this is the first ever government to government agreement that has been executed at a state level. So a lot of times Alaska is making the list for all the wrong reasons, but in this instance, we're making the list for the right one. And it does also recognize, as I mentioned before, the inherent authority of tribes as sovereigns. I know that sometimes folks down in Juneau get a little bit nervous when we use the T word, whether it's tax or tribes. So I always like to say, think of tribes really as your local government. In a lot of these villages where there's been a mass exodus of residents from rural communities into urban communities, the tribe is the constant there when the local government doesn't have enough funding to keep its lights on. Next slide, please. This is a list of all of the tribal co-signers so far. In addition, folks out in the Valley area will be happy to know that Connect Tribal Council has also signed on as of the last negotiation. So we'll be adding them to this as well. Next slide. This is a quick implementation timeline of the work and where tribes are at right now with the state. When this was negotiated and executed in 2017, that was the state's fiscal year 2018. So there was a lot of implementation and design and redesign of existing programs. 2019, we saw a change in state administrations between Governor Walker and now Governor Dunleavy, and the governor did take a moment to pause and reassess the compact, as is his prerogative. So there was a bunch of work that had been negotiated that the tribes would be assuming related to relative searches, family contact, licensing, and safety evaluations, but the state declined to enter into any of those agreements because of the new administration. Next slide. In fiscal year 2020, 2020, the parties did work out their differences. Governor Dunleavy felt comfortable with the compact, and all 5 of the previously negotiated scopes were implemented. In FY21 and 22, these are really our COVID years where we saw a sort of freezing of the status quo. No additional scopes were brought online. Scopes is just a shorthand term for the services and supports that the tribes assume on behalf of the state and administer for the state. Next slide. In FY23, the tribes continue to work on all 5 of those previous scopes in addition to prevention activities, which is new as well. Next slide. One of the, I think, really important aspects of the compact is that this is also a public-private partnership. This isn't an agreement just between our tribes and the state of Alaska, but what we were doing up here is so cutting edge that it attracted the attention of Casey Family Programs, which is the largest foster care and services foundation in the country. And they have continued to infuse both monetary resources and technical assistance resources into keeping the compact going, with the hope of taking what we've done here in Alaska down to the lower 48, particularly the Plain State tribes, and helping them transform their child welfare systems based on what we're doing here. Next slide. The long-term goals of the compact are really simple. We want to improve the life outcomes of children who enter state custody, whether they're Alaska Native or non-Native. We want to provide services in a more cost-effective and efficient manner. And we want children to be served as close to home as possible. Next slide. Thank you for giving me these 5 minutes. I wish all of you the best of luck in your races. Congratulations on entering the pool of candidates, and Brooke will share my contact information if you want to follow up with any of the information that I shared with you today. Thanks, Brooke. Thanks, Trevor.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I really appreciate your time and sharing that. It is, in terms of kids count, you know, really tribal compacting, it spans the whole of all the categories, right? And so this is an excellent example of the tribal child welfare compact, but you also, you know, there's been discussions in Juneau and initial work done on tribal compacting for schools. And so there's just a lot of really amazing opportunity when you look at it in that aspect. So, anyway, just thank you for your time, and go ahead and screen share again. Okay. Okay. There we go. All right, everyone. Thanks for your handling of my patience with my technical difficulties. We wouldn't be on Zoom if we didn't have some. So our next speaker is Stephanie Berglund, CEO of Thread, and she is here today to speak on childcare. And so Stephanie, if you want to take it away.
Thanks, Brooke. There you go. Can you hear me now? Good afternoon, everyone. Want to give a big thank you to the Alaska Children's Trust, Brooke and Trevor, for hosting. We're a proud partner of the Vote for Kids work. And thank you to all of you and candidates and your staff for joining in and learning more about children and family issues. And I'm excited to share a little bit more about childcare today. Again, I'm Stephanie Berglund, the CEO of Thread, and Thread is the childcare resource and referral organization working to increase access to affordable and high quality childcare to support more positive outcomes for children and families. We've been working with families, early educators, early childhood education programs, and communities across the state for over 3 decades now. And in addition to our direct services, we do monitor the childcare marketplace and trends, and childcare is a sector which is deeply connected to the quality of life here in our state, the health of our state, education, and our economy in all of our Alaskan communities. Next slide, please. So Thread looks at childcare in issues in 3 different buckets. We talk about childcare related to access, affordability, and quality. And the current childcare sector is in crisis, and it is slower than most other sectors to recover from COVID impacts. So I want to just focus on access today, as the demand for high quality, accessible childcare in Alaska is greater than the number of childcare slots that are currently available. Thread is estimating that that is about 50% gap, but it's likely worse than that. Access to childcare is really important, not only for child development and school readiness, but for families to be able to get to work, training, and for families to have choices and options to live and thrive in our communities, and also to help make our economy strong. We're hearing from more families who are not being able to go to work. Some are having to leave their job and are making decisions for one parent not to work, even though they would like to, due to the lack of childcare. And that's really because two things are happening. We don't have enough childcare businesses across the state. And of those that are open, these businesses are really struggling, and they're mainly struggling with recruiting and retaining staff. So that means that many children who could be served in existing childcare programs are not able to be served because of staffing and workforce issues also in the early childhood marketplace. Without access to childcare, young children and families are directly impacted, of course, but that rolls up to our overall quality of life in Alaska, how we're supporting the working adults that we all need, and thus ultimately the ability for our economy to stabilize and grow. So there are a few data sources here that I want to call your attention to. On the next slide, the good news is, working together, we can tell a new story for childcare in Alaska. So I wanted to highlight some policy solutions that Thread encourages you to consider. These are policy solutions to the challenges that families and early educators and businesses and communities are all facing. Related to access, we have an opportunity to build on the success of the READS Act that was recently passed, and with the expansion of pre-K, how can we continue to build additional capacity building programs? And that includes investing in our childcare workforce, and that workforce pipeline through training and educational partnerships, for example, through our university systems. Through affordability, we need to help make childcare more affordable. It's really expensive for families, and we have an opportunity through policies to encourage businesses to invest more in childcare benefits for their employees, and looking at how we can really look at childcare more as a public good and invest in it at the federal, state, and local levels. So like I mentioned, childcare is very expensive. Families in Alaska are spending an average of 12 to 35% of their household income. And there's a US Health and Human Services benchmark that it should be closer to 7%. So that's something that we're looking at closing the gap on. In terms of quality, we don't want to sacrifice the quality of early childhood learning experiences while we work on access. So we encourage policies that can adopt Learn and Grow, which is our statewide quality standard framework. Currently, just 33% of children in Alaska are considered prepared when they enter kindergarten. That's a statistic through our Department of Education and Early Development. So we know access to high quality programs in early childhood benefit children. They can benefit from our highly qualified educators and stronger interactions with caregivers, and ultimately have greater opportunities for early learning development, and that supports them in stronger healthy development and readiness for school. So solving the economic crisis of childcare is going to require public investment, but we know we can leverage that through other creative community partnerships and targeted policies and intentional funding strategies through a bipartisan effort to find solutions to childcare. So I'm here to be a resource for you. Thread has lots of data and information to help you in learning more, and we look forward to partnering with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, so next up we have All Alaska Pediatric Partnership, also referred to sometimes as A2P2. And so we have Executive Director Tamara Van Josef, as well as Elizabeth Schultz, Community Relations Manager. And so I think we're going to start off with Elizabeth and to talk about early childhood.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for doing this and making time out. I thank you for your service, those of you that are serving and those of you that are running. We understand that this is an all family on deck kind of a role, and all of your families are involved in these races and in the service that you play to the state. So thank you for all that you're doing. I do want to share with you a little bit about the early childhood work that A2P2 has been able to learn about. If you don't know about us, A2P2 is a statewide agency that promotes health and wellness for all of Alaska's children through partnership building, systems change work, and advocacy. As part of our partnership building work, we host a group called the Alaska Early Childhood Network, or ECN for short. This is a peer-to-peer network of early childhood coalition leaders that has been meeting monthly for the past 2 years to support one another and to learn from another. And we meet across diverse communities all across Alaska. So this has been a wonderful partnership of relationships that has helped A2P2 kind of have our ear to the ground to what's happening all over the state and what community leaders that are working in the healthcare fields and the early childhood education fields are telling us about what it is like in their communities to serve families and to support early childhood efforts. And what we have learned is that there is a consistent concern about the lack of coordination and investment in early childhood care and resources, including both the emotional and professional hardships that are experienced by families and professionals in this sector. As we just heard from Thread, there is a need for sustainable support for quality and affordable childcare at this time, and this is a huge workforce issue that is having ripple effects around the state. I thought you might be interested to know that the Coast Guard base in Valdez is at risk right now for losing its qualification as a family-friendly base because Valdez has now unfortunately had to close their only licensed childcare. They only had one to begin with, and they knew that this was a possible risk coming up, but they were not able to sustain that licensed childcare center. So with it closing now, this just happened this last week. I reached out to the ombudsman at the Valdez Coast Guard office, and she doesn't know. She said their families are kind of reeling right now and wondering how they're going to stay and serve in the community that doesn't seem to have sustainable support for the early childhood needs of that community. So this is a huge community issue that has ripple effects all across many different small towns and rural areas in our state. I also wanted to share briefly some data from our Help Me Grow Alaska program. Help Me Grow Alaska runs a call center staffed with family support specialists who speak with families all across Alaska every day. Not only has our call volume increased exponentially every year that we've been open, I want you to know, as you can see from these slides here, in that blue there, that 40%, that is the amount of calls that we have received in the last few years specific to mental health needs. And I know many of you have heard this statistic shared, and many of you on the call know this, that our country and our state specifically are in a crisis for mental health supports for children and youth. But our call volume and our data support this, that our families are really, really struggling, and they're asking for more supports, more coordination. Their story to us often is that the system of care that they're trying to navigate in their communities is so complex and confusing, and sometimes not even there. There aren't resources in communities where we really need them, that they're getting discouraged. And you can see that in the lives and the mental health, not only of the children, but often everyone in a family system. We're really struggling, and that is something that A2P2 is taking very seriously and building relationships around the state and talking with federal agencies as well to find a better and more coordinated way to support our early childhood system. And with that, I want to turn it over to our executive director who wants to share some of this early childhood governance work.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes, and so I'm going to give a very high-level overview of this work that that Elizabeth referenced, but you can read a lot more about it in the resources on this slide and in this website, earlychildhoodalaska.com. And I believe these resources will also be emailed out to you all with the slides. So the background is that back in September 2020, a group convened to create a statewide early childhood strategic plan that is called Early Childhood Alaska, a strategic direction for 2020 through 2025. We finalized that toward the end of 2020, and then it was later, the strategic plan was later adopted by Alaska's Early Childhood Coordinating Council in March of 2021. And when I say adopted, it was the plan was adopted. However, the council doesn't have authority or capacity to really actionize the strategic plan. So it's more of a sort of informal agreement that these are state level priorities that we should all be individually as organizations, as policymakers working toward. So that effort to create the strategic plan was convened as a response to challenges that existed with Alaska's current landscape of services and programs that target young children and pregnant mothers. The challenge, some of those challenges, or one of the major challenges in that is around driving systems change for this sector. So Alaska's early childhood system is very fragmented. And I think even in this setting, we probably would be hard pressed to define what an early childhood system is, or what you each consider the early childhood system. So depending on how you enter the system, it might mean childcare to you. It might mean early care, early learning and education. It might mean developmental health, postnatal support, foster care. So we would like to encourage you to think about an early childhood system as all of the above, all the components and factors that impact a child's well-being from the moment that they are conceived and enter this world, and through the age of 8. In Alaska, state early childhood health, education, and prenatal services and programs live in 3 different departments now. Up until July, it was 2 departments. Now it's 3, resulting in essentially a scattershot of separate systems, funding streams, very complex funding streams with eligibility requirements, and decision-making authority happening across these 3 departments. We don't have a formalized or coordinated leadership for early childhood systems and programs, or a way to have this decision-making authority across the continuum of programs and funding streams that make up the breadth of an early childhood system. And this challenge makes it really difficult for entities like A2P2 or THREAD or the Children's Trust or the Food Bank to create lasting changes that can really shift the statistics of what we're seeing on this kids count data toward improvements in how children and families are faring here in the state. So one of the specific strategies in the strategic plan that I am talking about now relates to goal number 3 of the plan. The goal is that Alaska children and families are supported by a functional, comprehensive, mixed delivery early childhood system. And one of the strategies under that goal recommends creating an improved, sustainable, and accountable governance approach with decision-making authority. So about 2 years ago, right at the start of the pandemic, so 2.5 years ago, a group of around 14 stakeholders, including some folks who are on this call here, Trevor, Stephanie, and there are others probably, got together to work with a pair of consultants from a national organization that has a lot of experience on working on systems change, specifically around early childhood. And we have been working very hard for 2.5 years to reimagine what this new governance structure might look like for coordinating and managing Alaska's early childhood programs and services in a way that truly engages communities, collaborates more intentionally with tribes, and creates this continuum of care for starting with prenatal services and supports, and through age 8 to support that transition from before kindergarten and into K through 12. So I'm not going to go into the details of what this structure looks like. It's in the resources that are posted here. So there's one document that kind of gives a background to everything I talked about, the context, the challenges, what it's trying to address. And then there's the draft model that we proposed, and a document with Q&As that answer some of the questions that came up throughout this process of designing this new model. Currently, the model is just very much still in draft. We're in the process of soliciting feedback on the model from stakeholders and partners, folks all around the state. We had a series of roundtables and are going to be continuing to revise it and seek feedback for a while longer before any action is taken toward trying to push this toward legislation. But this is definitely something to be aware of. Just reading these documents, and the strategic plan is also posted on the website, will give you good background on what are the challenges and barriers that face Alaska's early childhood sector, families, providers, organizations, state agencies. Yeah, if you have any other questions, happy to answer later on, or you can reach out to me or to Elizabeth offline as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tamara and Elizabeth. Next, we have Thomas Azzarella, Executive Director of the Alaska After School Network, to talk about the importance of out-of-school time. Thomas?
Great, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for having me today and speaking on behalf of out-of-school time. So out-of-school time refers to a wide variety of different types of positive activities for young people to be involved in, both before school, after school, weekend programs, vacation programs, summer camps, teen drop-in centers, and the wide gamut of other different type of programming. As a matter of fact, today I'm zooming in from one of our program providers down in Gurwood, the Gurwood Public Library, and getting a chance to view some of their programming. Next slide, please. So why does out of school time matter? Or you'll see we are the Alaska After School Network. We use both terms interchangeably. Out of school time has, some major roles in supporting students from kindergarten through 12th grade. We know that students only spend a small percentage of their time in school during the school year, and the bulk of their time is spent out of school. So how do we engage young people in positive skill building opportunities to really enforce those protective factor developments that help reduce the risk of engagement in negative risk behaviors? What we know is that a connection to a meaningful adult, a supportive adult, or a mentor in out of school time hours can be one of the largest protective factors for a student in kindergarten, 12th grade, outside of a strong family support system. After school programs and before school programs and summer camps are known for really being a protective factor themselves, and also providing a space and context for the development of additional protective factors. Again, that helped young people graduate on time, support their mental health, reduce their risk of substance misuse and delinquency, and a host of other behaviors as well. Next slide, please. What we do have to share with you is that there is some exciting news. We as a state of Alaska have had a significant improvement in the coordination, support, and quality of out-of-school time programming throughout the state. And a survey that's conducted nationally by the After School Alliance approximately every 5 years, we have seen a significant increase in our ranking nationally. So in 2020, right before the pandemic, Alaska was ranked 4th in the country for quality out of school time, moving up from 46 in 2009, 31st in 2014 to now 4th place in 2020. This rise in ranking is largely based on parent satisfaction of programming, as well as really a greater investment in this state around coordinating and supports for students kindergarten through 12th grade, around increasing networking and collaboration, and around supporting the educator as well. This rise is also because of an increased investment from the federal government through the federal 21st Century Community Learning Centers, as well as the Child Care Development Block Grant, as you heard from Stephanie with Thread, is included in that child care system of that licensed school-age child care program at elementary schools. Additionally, in 2018, the state of Alaska invested marijuana sales tax revenue in the Marijuana Education and Treatment Fund, which designates part of its funding to Positive Youth Development After School Grant Program that is targeted at supporting middle school age youth and out of school time programming to reduce the risk of substance misuse, including alcohol and marijuana use. That funding stream is now in effect in over 33 communities around the state. Next slide. Well, we have lots of good news to celebrate about where we are ranking nationally for our increase in quality. What we do know is that for every one student in an after-school program, there are 3 waiting to be there. Alaska has significant after-school and out-of-school time deserts that prevent young people from being able to engage and find a spark and supportive adult in their life during the out-of-school time hours. What we know is that there is nearly 52% of children in the state would be enrolled in the after-school program if one is available as well from our state surveys. We see that the demand is ever increasing, and especially during the pandemic, we have seen that really come to a greater head as we saw families really struggling with doing homeschool and needing that additional support. Many of our out-of-school time partners picking up. What we do know, just like the childcare industry, our out-of-school time programs are facing a significant challenge. In the municipality of Anchorage, more than 50% of our out-of-school time partners still have not reopened, largely due to both increased cost of staffing, difficulty in finding staff that are qualified and able to work a part-time split shift job, as well as many other challenges facing the field. We are working together across the state, and we are really tapping into and connecting with both our state agencies as well as our both state, federal, and local officials on how we can expand this critical support to help young people thrive and support them. What we do know, as you'll hear in a moment as well, is around youth mental health first aid. One of the best ways that we can help really support young people's mental health is by keeping them engaged, getting them off of screen times, into physical activities that boost their natural dopamine levels and really support that healthy social connection between peers and other adults. With that, I will say thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Thomas. Next, we have Amanda Metivier, who will speak on foster care in Alaska. Amanda's the director of the Child Welfare Academy, which is associated with the university. Amanda, take it away.
Thank you, Brooke and Trevor and the Children's Trust for bringing us all together around this. I'm the new director of the Alaska Child Welfare Academy at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and we provide training, technical assistance, and coaching for mainly state child protection staff and other legal and tribal partners across the state, professionals in the field of child welfare. We also offer direct services to young people who are transitioning out of foster care and into post-secondary education and training, careers, and do some work with Facing Foster Care in Alaska around youth-led advocacy, really lifting up the experiences of young people who have been in foster care. I personally am a former foster youth. I spent 3 years in foster care in Anchorage a long time ago now, before aging out of the system. And my husband and I have been foster parents off and on for about 14 years. We've adopted young people from the system, and most recently, as of last week, became relative caregivers to our nephew who has experienced foster care. And so as a professional and in my own personal life, I've really been sort of living and breathing our child welfare system now in Alaska for over 20 years. And I can tell you what makes a difference for families is when policymakers care. I think the pendulum certainly swings. And so kudos to all of you who are on this call. I think that it's nice to see some familiar faces or familiar names and faces, but for those of you that are new and coming into this, I think really educating yourself on the issues and hearing from those that are in the field and doing the work, but also reaching out to families is critical to making a difference for children and families in our state. Brooke, if you could go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about two specific areas with regard to foster care. I know earlier Nicole touched on tribal compacting, which has been a pretty major effort. There have been a number of reform efforts in our state over the last 10, even 20 years around improving outcomes for children and families involved in our foster care system. I mean, the unfortunate piece of child abuse and neglect is if it gets to that place, foster care is the result, right? So we've been talking a lot about prevention and efforts to build up and offer family supports through protective factors. But when OCS, the Office of Children's Services, picks up the phone, it's already too late, right? That call has been made and something's happened to children. And so I want to focus on two specific areas related to foster care. So what does the current data tell us? What is the state of the field? Today, we have 2,958 children statewide who are in foster care with the Office of Children's Services. About 66% of them are Alaskan Native or American Indian. We have just over 1,400 licensed foster homes. One of the impacts of the pandemic was that we lost about 600 foster homes statewide. And so typically if children can't be placed with relatives, if they're unavailable or not in the community, they'll go into a home setting with a foster family, a licensed foster family, or maybe a friend of that family. COVID created a lot of fear in people around fear of infection, but also we lost childcare. And so a lot of people gave up their foster care licenses. What does that mean? That means that children are sleeping in hotels, some tonight, that the state contracts with actually a security company for children when they can't find a foster home, and they staff hotels round the clock for children to stay in hotels. They may sleep in state offices, in child protection offices, shelter settings, or maybe in group homes or residential facilities. And so we took a really big hit in terms of family and home-based care because of the pandemic. Another really critical piece of what we experienced because of the pandemic was the turnover rate among frontline child protection staff has increased. So pre-pandemic, it was around typically 30-40%. We're looking at an almost 60% turnover rate among frontline child protection staff. So Nicole mentioned earlier that the staff or the agency typically maintains about a 50% vacancy rate. What does that really look like though? What does that mean for families? That means when OCS comes knocking on the door of a family and starts to do an assessment around child abuse and neglect, and if the decision is made to remove, and then a new worker comes on, it's like a new lens. They're taking on the case for the first time. And so with each new worker, the case is further drawn out. It's detrimental to families. It really delays timelines to getting children out of foster care because the ultimate goal is to reunify children with their biological family or the caregiver that they came from, or to move to an alternate permanent plan through guardianship or adoption or something different. And so it creates a lot more strain on the experience that families have with the system in being able to work a case plan or do whatever it is that they need to do to reunify or figure out the best plan for children who experience foster care. And we also see more frequent moves among children with both lack of placements and a higher rate of turnover among frontline child protection staff. So I have a short video I wanted to share this, and hopefully it works this time. But this last year, our department received some funding through the American Recovery Act and the state of Alaska to run foster care recruitment ads. And so we partnered with young people and foster parents across the state to run a series of ads on TV, streaming services, social media, anywhere that we could hit. They're still running. So I will close with Jesse and Dawn's story, and I'll put my contact information in the chat, and we'll stay on for questions as well.
Just having a substantial place to stay at and having a connection with people for a little bit is helpful, because not everybody can have a home forever. Hey.
How's your day?
It was okay.
We decided to be foster parents back in 2014. And we've had a wide variety of children, boys, girls, transgender youth. It's all rewarding.
Hey.
You're definitely gonna make an impact in the kid's life. It's what kind of impact are you gonna make? And you get to choose that.
Haven't had the most substantial homes, just moving around a lot, so just having that one caregiver to be there, as Dawn has, for me, has been very helpful.
There is no perfect family. There is no perfect individual. It's what you make it.
Selfie time.
It takes just one person to change a life.
You can make a difference too.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Next up, and just so everyone on the call knows, we've got a couple more topics and then we'll get to question and answers. So thanks for listening so intently to these really critical topics. Next, we have Cara Durr with Food Bank of Alaska to speak on child hunger and poverty in Alaska.
Great, thank you, Brooke, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon to listen to all these topics. You can go ahead and advance the first slide. So I'm with the Food Bank of Alaska. We are a statewide organization working with about 150 partners around the state to distribute food out to people in need, among other things. But just going to touch on child poverty and hunger today. There's a lot of statistics in here, and you're probably a bit overloaded by this point. So I'll keep it high level and know you'll get these slides. But generally speaking, we're experiencing about a 15% child food insecurity rate in Alaska. So a lot of this is 2020 data. So, you know, it's kind of pre-pandemic. And I'm going to go into some of the impacts of the pandemic and the current economic crisis we're facing with inflation, but want to kind of set a baseline. This map here is from Feeding America's Map the Meal Gap study. And this shows food insecurity rates for children by region. So the darker the area, the more food insecurity that area is for kids. So that very dark area over in Western Alaska is the Kisilac census area, which is consistently our most food insecure region. I think it's important for this conversation to note that families with children, especially with young children, tend to be more food insecure and more likely to live in poverty than others. Next slide. So during the pandemic, obviously there was a huge increase in hunger. I think this was, well reported. This is not going to be a surprise to anybody. But our network, on average, reported at the height of the pandemic about a 75% increase in need. That has since dropped, of course, but it's still really remained elevated ever since the start of the pandemic. Next slide. And now what we're facing is a current economic crisis driven by inflation and a number of things. So our partners, once again, are seeing those really high, near record numbers of people in need, people visiting pantries, meal programs, things like that. So obviously the high prices are driving costs up for families, making them turn to food assistance programs. I think it's important to note that for low-income families, they're typically spending about a third of their budget on food. So you can imagine the impact that it has. Those high prices are, of course, experienced by organizations like the Food Bank and our partners. And so times like this, so summer's typically a low time for donations, and we are often buying food to supplement the low donations. This year, we're seeing extra low donations, and then of course, extra high prices. So our dollars aren't going as far either. And we have trucks on the road, we're shipping food around the state. So all those costs are increased as well. Supply chain issues really factor in here for us as well. We operate a number of federal food programs, and supply chain issues have impacted those. So for example, we operate a program called the Emergency Food Assistance Program. And we're seeing a lot of our orders just be canceled at the last minute. So it's a bunch of food that we're depending on that we suddenly don't get because they're able to turn around and sell it, to Europe or elsewhere for higher prices. And then the last thing I want to mention impacting families right now is there has been a really tremendous federal response during the pandemic and a lot of aid flowing through, but a lot of that is sunsetting, it's expiring. So families are kind of adjusting to that. At the same time, they're experiencing higher than normal costs. One important one to note is that the SNAP program, so food stamps, has seen big increases during the pandemic. So through a program called emergency allotments, everyone has received the maximum benefit for their household, but that is ending this month. So I think there's definitely a lot of concern from us and our partners that next month we're going to see these numbers and this need increase even more. Next slide. So since that was a bit doom and gloom, want to focus on some positive things, and there is a lot in here. And we, of course, have tons of great ideas for policy recommendations. And food security or food insecurity is a very complex topic. So there are lots of different ways to get at it. And I will say there's a lot of really exciting things happening at the state right now. I think the pandemic has really just shed a light on this issue. And so there has been a lot of attention given to just to hunger and food security. There is going to be a food strategy task force established in the legislature, which, should be a great avenue to discuss some of these policy solutions. And we had a lot of great wins in the state budget this year and a lot of great federal resources. So there's positive, but of course, there's always more to do. And we are always kind of focusing at the food bank on two areas, which is really just strengthening the federal nutrition programs, which just because they're federal, of course, the federal elected officials have a big role to play in this, but so do state, because a lot of these programs can be implemented in different ways on the state level, which of course impacts how they're run and how people can access them. So programs like child nutrition programs, SNAP is a big one, and others. And then the second piece is just supporting the charitable food bank network, as well as other nonprofits that are serving low-income children and families. And there's, of course, a number of ways to do this. And I will be very happy to follow up with anybody and share our great ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. And last but certainly not least, we're going to talk about youth mental health, and we're pleased to welcome Jason Lassard, Executive Director of NAMI Anchorage, to lead us in that. This was a pretty big topic for us at ACT down in Juneau as well, and I think probably many of you have heard, as with many of the topics that we've discussed today, just even more of a concern since the pandemic. I believe the American Academy of Pediatrics declared a national emergency of child and adolescent mental health, and the U.S. Surgeon General declared, a crisis of youth mental health. So anyway, welcoming Jason to walk us through some of what Alaska looks like on this topic.
Great. Thank you, Brooke. Thanks also to Trevor and the rest of the team at Alaska Children's Trust. Thank you to all the other presenters, and thank you, candidates, for attending this briefing event, whatever you want to call it. Really appreciate your time, and I just want to stress that these are really, really high overviews of some of these issues, and I really encourage you to reach out to some of the presenters here or their organizations to learn more about these topics, because they will be very important for you to be well versed on as you enter your roles or continue your roles in as lawmakers. So NAMI is the acronym stands for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. NAMI is the largest grassroots mental health organization dedicated to building better lives for millions of Americans affected by mental illness, their families and communities. We have, in addition to the affiliate that I'm the executive director of here in Anchorage, we have affiliates in Fairbanks, Juneau, and the North Slope, and we are always looking to grow and expand our programming around the state. Brooke, can you hit the next slide, please? So I'm going to really touch on a few, again, high-level things just to kind of set a tone and set a framework for your mind as you move forward looking at this. So a lot of folks really don't understand the prevalence of mental illness in our communities. A lot of that is because of stigma and the sort of the shame that people feel about talking about it. But statistically, 1 in 5 U.S. adults experiences a mental illness. As far in how that translates into youth, 17% of youth aged 6 to 17 experience a mental health disorder. We'll learn a little bit more about why that number is a little lower than the adults experiencing, mostly to do with onset. But some other things to think about in regards to youth and mental health. 70% of our youth in the juvenile justice system have at least one diagnosable mental health condition. And you have to wonder, if we were able to get them help a little earlier, what the populations of our juvenile justice system might look like. Hopefully a little different. So one of the things that I really try to drill in when I talk about youth mental health is the onset of mental illness. And this is really staggering to think about. 50% of all lifetime mental illnesses begin by the age of 14. Now that's a high school freshman. That's somebody on the early stages of puberty, all sorts of changes going through their life, and then you factor in a mental health condition, and it just becomes really cumbersome and burdensome and very difficult for youth to navigate, especially when they don't understand what's going on, and they don't have the language to even communicate what might be happening with them. Additionally, 75% of all lifetime mental illnesses begin by age 14, right? So again, this is largely happening in the youth and the adolescent brain. So it's important that we talk with them about it as their brain is going through these changes. Next slide, please. So, there's a lot of data that you can look into that is specific to Alaska. I wanted to touch on a couple of high level things, but things that I think really point to the growing need, the ever growing need for us to address this. Our suicide rates are, as a state, nearly double the national average. Alaska youth between 2016 and 2019, the suicide rate was 3 times the national average. And suicide remains the leading cause for Alaska adolescents between 15 and 24. I hope this comes as no surprise, these statistics to you. This is a big problem that we've been trying to address for quite some time. But I would like to point out that suicide is preventable. Mental illness is not so much, but mental illness can be treated. And so when we think about all the folks that we have lost through suicide, it's important to remember that 90% of those folks have a diagnosable mental health condition or substance misuse disorder that is treatable. So again, if we can build up our systems of care and community-based supports, we might be able to actually really take a good chunk out of this really awful rate of suicide that we have in our state. Secondly, this is according to the YRBS data, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that's done every 2 years in the state. Unfortunately, this only goes through 2019 because in 2021, we were in the midst of the pandemic and they canceled the study. But over the course of 12 years, from 2007 to 2019, we've seen a steady increase in the amount of students who reported feeling sad or hopeless for 2 weeks or more at a time. That's essentially the definition of a depressive episode. So, we're trending in the wrong direction, and that can be sad to see and really frustrating working in the field, but I'm hopeful that we can start to make change. COVID has highlighted the need for us to really take a second look at youth and youth mental health. At the same time, it's exacerbated it, unfortunately. But again, I think there's a lot that can be done. We had a bill for the last couple sessions that would standardize mental health education in statute by just not formalizing a curriculum, but creating standards and guidelines. That would do a lot to destigmatize the conversations around mental health with youth, and maybe they might seek treatment earlier. Again, there's an 11-year gap between when someone finds their symptoms or the symptoms arise and between the time they seek treatment. So if the onset's at age 14, you're talking 25 on average before that person seeks treatment. They've already gone through such a major part of their life and a developmental part of their life with this illness that might have been easier for them. It might have been a different route had they had the opportunity to address that. So what can we do as a community? What can we do as lawmakers? Here's a few things. Support mental health education in school. Again, there's been bills over the last couple of years. Most recently, this last year, it was HB 60 and SB 80. A lot of folks on these calls were supporters of that bill. And I understand it will be making a return again this next session. So keep an eye out for that. Increasing school-based mental health services. Counselors, right? Folks that the youth can talk to and can learn from in school about this kind of stuff and have as a resource that's might be perceived as to them as unbiased, right? It's not from their home. Sometimes a lot of your stressors come from home and you need somebody to talk to outside of that. So looking at more school-based services, reducing the amount of uninsured children. This would go a long way as well. We really need to expand the care continuum around our state and prop up more community-based care. Even now, there's a dearth of resources. You know, we just had this major change on a national level where they instituted 988 as the new crisis line to call. So you didn't have to remember a 10-digit care line number or something like that. And that's fantastic. However, what comes after 988? We've got the crisis call line, we might have crisis services, but what comes for that care that's going to be there for them after the crisis, when they're on their journey to recovery, right? We need more community-based services instead of sending our youth or adolescents to the larger communities here in the state, or sometimes even out of state, where we know they get better care when they're closer to the people around them in their circle. And then another thing, which I know you've heard in various iterations in these presentations, is we need more workforce development. From my perspective, particularly in the case of healthcare workers and behavioral healthcare workers, I serve on the governing body of API for the last 3.5 years. It has been a constant struggle to get staff. And if you don't have staff, you can't do the work. So we need to, as a state, look at a way to create incentives or what have you to help develop our own workforce so that we can do a lot of that stuff here in the state, closer to where folks are going to get the better care and be closer to their families. So I know we've been a little long. I'm gonna leave it there. I am more than happy to speak with any of you directly, answer any of your questions or what have you around this topic. I'm very passionate about it. I could go for a whole hour just myself talking about this, but let's just leave it at that. And thank you once again to all the folks at ACT and for everybody else on the call. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our incredible partners for sharing your expertise here today. I know we went a little over, but we do want to offer the opportunity for any questions. I saw some going through the chat and getting answered in the chat. So with that, feel free to use the raise your hand feature or just jump in if there's anything you'd like to ask before we conclude today. And of course, if you don't have anything right now or want to follow up in general, we'll be sending out that follow-up email with everyone's contact information as well. Go ahead, Shoshana.